This is an examination of the hidden human condition.
This is the Hidden Killers Podcast.
With Tony Brueski.
We are joined by defense attorney Bob Motta, also host of the podcast Defense Diaries, talking about Brian Kohberger right now. As we know, the motion coming up on the 1st at the end of this week to dismiss is going to be raised by Ann Taylor in the courtroom. We already have the speedy trial waived, so there's no October 2nd date, but Ann Taylor is going to still try, as far as we know, to argue the motion to dismiss. Bob, as a defense attorney, can you explain this to us in a way that we're going to understand as best as possible?
Yeah, I can. And hi, Tony. How are you? Good to see you, man. Or good to hear you, at least. So what I've been thinking about this is I think that Ann Taylor has been probably, eating dinner with other lawyers for the past 10 years, kind of waiting for an indictment by grand jury because they're very unusual in Idaho.
Okay.
They typically go by preliminary hearing. I mean, that's like throughout the entire state. From what I've read. Now, I've never practiced there, so if there's a practicing Idaho attorney out there that could say, hey, we go to grand jury all the time, then I'm incorrect in that. But From what I've read, they primarily almost always go via preliminary hearing which this was scheduled to go to.
Yes.
And that was the big brouhaha when the state kind of snuck in there and said, we're going to decide to go grand jury, which I had predicted back in February. To me, it would have been nuts for them to have gone to a preliminary hearing because of the media attention to this case. There, as much as some people don't want to acknowledge the fact that a jury pool can be tainted by constant negative press about a defendant, the fact of the matter is that it can and it does happen all the time. So, and I think that the judge, the preceding judge, and now judge are hyper vigilant about that and that aspect. No one wants us to get kicked back on appeal, in terms of finding out that the jury pool was so tainted that they couldn't impanel a fair and impartial jury. So, he's taken it to great lengths to keep everything sealed, kind of keeping us out of the loop, which drives everybody nuts and which leads to, all the Twitter wars that you see going on, where people are speculating. So I think that she's had this argument in her back pocket forever. And it's really kind of an esoteric argument in the sense that she is saying that, and this is in layman terms, or lay people terms. So she is basically saying that the Idaho Constitution, the state constitution of Idaho, has set the standard for a grand jury indictment that it essentially has to be beyond a reasonable doubt, which, as we all know, as true crime consumers, that essentially what that means is that's trial. That's the standard for trial. Okay. That is not the standard for either a probable cause hearing for, binding it over to trial. So and what she's saying is that the Constitution of Idaho supersedes the rule that is in the Idaho criminal rules, the ICR. Okay. So that rule clearly establishes that it's just probable cause. Probable cause that, number one, a crime was committed, and number two, that it was the defendant that committed the crime.
Sure.
So that's the typical standard. That's the standard everywhere in the country. All right. So, but what she's saying is that when the legislature created, or actually it's the Supreme Court of Idaho created the Idaho criminal rules, that they overstepped, that they didn't have the authority to override the Constitution of the state of Idaho. It's an interesting argument, because they are two very competing things. And if you read the Constitution, it's never been amended in terms of what's required. And that language that she cites in that motion is accurate, So you have these two competing things and they're very different burdens. So, and she's basically arguing, look, they went in and they went to the grand jury and they gave them the wrong burden. They gave them just the probable cause burden. The Constitution of Idaho says that they have to basically find the same burden that you would have at trial, because that's what the language says, which is beyond a reasonable doubt.
Sure.
So it's going to be for legal nerds, it's going to be a very interesting conversation and argument. I'm chomping at the bit to hear it. I don't think that there's any way on God's green earth that she is going to prevail on it, but it is a very interesting legal argument.
Even
so that's hopefully people understand what I was saying. Did you understand what I was saying?
I do. And the technicalities of it, she may be right. But at the end of the day, though, even if they look at this and go, technically, you are correct. So what do we do now? Does that just then wipe away the initial grand jury indictment and then we go to another grand jury indictment? Or does it go to a different type of hearing? Like, what would be the path forward if she does succeed?
If she did succeed and he dismissed that grand jury indictment, that doesn't mean that Kohberger's walking. That means, they'd have to do the process all over again.
This is the Hidden Killers Podcast.
Want more? Start binging on all of our true crime podcasts right now through Apple Podcasts and get an ad-free experience when you sign up to be a True Crime Today Premium Plus member exclusively on Apple Podcasts.
More of the Hidden Killers Podcast dropping soon.
Press subscribe now.